So our first test for the 10-step self-screen is our waist to hip ratio. This is an important little test we can do at home with a measuring tape, and it highlights our lifestyle and the reasons why we may be here. So what we're testing is the visceral fat around our organs, and that's been linked to a whole heap of lifestyle issues such as diabetes, heart issues, and other things like that. So the reason why we're doing it is to get a really good starting place for us to work on, and if we do have excess visceral fat around our organs, we do really need to address that through nutrition and caloric tracking. So what we're looking to do when we do our waist to hip ratio is we're taking the measurement of the smallest part of our waist and then the largest part of our hips, and we're dividing the waist by the hip measurement. When we're looking for an acceptable score for men, we're looking for a score of 0.9 or below, and for females, we're looking for 0.8 and below. Our second test for our 10-step self-screen is our breathing assessment. Our breathing underpins every way we move. So it's important for us to assess it and test whether we may have a faulty breathing pattern, but most importantly, to kit you out with some breathing drills to help rectify the pattern to allow you to get straight back into exercise. So what I want you to do is take a deep breath for me. Now, if you did any of these things, we may have a faulty breathing pattern. If you breathe in through your mouth, or you raise those shoulders excessively, we're not diaphragmatically breathing. Now, instead of going and worrying about we're not breathing properly and wondering why this may affect our exercise, here's a couple of exercises you can use to rectify that faulty breathing pattern that you can do at home or before your session. The first one being crocodile breathing. This is where we lay on the floor and we use the floor as proprioceptive feedback, i.e. we breathe into the floor, into our belly, to allow us to expand our abdominal area and push our diaphragm down. Let's take a look at how we do it. It's a simple setup, laying on our stomach. Now this is where we use the floor to give us feedback so we know we're breathing into the right place. We put our head on our hands and we simply breathe into our belly, trying to expand our belly as big as we can throughout deep nasal breaths. So that's breaths through the nose. So, pretty simple. You should feel that area expand while you breathe in through the nose, and we do that as much as we need until we feel like we can do it without too much thinking. We then bring that into laying on our back, up into our seated position here, and we try and maintain that diaphragmatic breathing. We can do things like keeping our hands around our belly and breathing into our hands. And we can focus on our breathing patterns there. So how do we add this to our exercise? Quite often we're going to lose our breath pattern when we get tired or we start to get fatigued or we're lifting heavy weights. So the plan is when we bring our diaphragmatic breathing into our training, if we're lifting heavy and require tension, we want to take some tension through the midsection, i.e. tensing a little bit, and then still maintaining that diaphragmatic breath. So we take tension, and we breathe in through our nose. That braces our midsection and allows us to bear weight. When we're fatigued, if we're doing something a little bit more high intensity, we should focus on those nasal breaths and breathing as deep into our belly as possible to calm our breath down in whichever position we're in. Our third test for our 10-step self-screen is one of our clearing tests. And now remembering from our very first rule when you started, pain. What we're looking for through this clearing test is just pain. Stiffness is okay. We're going to work on that later. So we're going to go through a lower back or spinal clearing assessment, which will also incorporate a little bit of shoulder mobility, a little bit of hamstring flexibility. So you might find that you are a little bit stiff, and that's more than okay. We'll touch on that later. First up, we're going to go into a simple downward dog pose. and then we'll roll into a cobra pose, and then finally finish off with a child's pose. So let's take a look at our first clearing test. Simple downward dog pose. Bum goes to the roof, and we're looking for our shoulders and back to see if there's any pain there. We're rolling into cobra now. The idea is to extend nice and long through the spine, and we're looking for any discomfort or pain through the lower back. And finally into child's pose, where we're sitting on our feet. We're reaching out as far as we can, and we're looking for any pain in those movements as well. So like I said, it's simply just pain. If we've got no pain throughout the movement and a little bit of stiffness, we can move on. Our fourth test for our 10-step self-screen is our neck, shoulder, and thoracic clearing test. Like our clearing test before it, we're looking for one thing: pain. If we have pain, we want to make sure we refer ourselves out to an adequately qualified professional to help us relieve some of the issues. For this clearing test, you will need either a broomstick or a dowel to help measure thoracic rotation, but for the most part, we can just use ourselves. We're going to kick off with a cervical clearing test, which is our neck. We're simply going to go sit nice and tall. We're going to go chin to chest, eyes to roof, side to side, and then tilting left and tilting right. Now, like I said, we're simply looking for pain. You might notice a bit of stiffness or restriction on some sides, but we'll work on that later. The next we have is our AC impingement clearing test. So what we're going to do is place our hand over onto our opposite shoulder. Now that hand can't leave the body while we do this test. So if our palm peels up, we've gone too far. So palm on top of the shoulder, raising the elbow as high as we can. Lowering down and onto the other side. So throughout that movement, we should have no pain. Our final clearing test is our thoracic rotation. We want to use our dowel here. We're going to put that on our shoulders, and we're going to rotate as far around to the left and right as we can. The measurement we're aiming for is about 45 degrees either side. But once again, we're simply looking for pain. And there we have it, guys. If you've got pain throughout any of those movements, make sure you refer yourself out to a physio and the like, get yourself sorted, and then we can move on. Next up, we have ankle mobility. Now, ankle mobility is super important for activities like squatting, lunging, and running. If we lack ankle mobility, we're really going to find it hard to get into the right position for a lot of exercises. It also is the first major joint that comes in contact with the ground when we're doing activities such as running. So it's important to know what the standards are and where you're at to know how to modify your exercise and get back to full activity. So what we're going to test today are two parts of ankle mobility: dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. We'll go through the standards that you need to achieve throughout each, and we'll also give you a couple of easy ways to test at home by yourself. So first up, we'll kick off with plantar flexion. Now that's pushing the toes away from ourselves. Simply, we're going to lay on our back, but I'll give you a quick explanation first. The ideal range is 20 to 30 degrees. Sorry, the acceptable range is 20 to 30 degrees away from that 90-degree position. So here we have 90, and we're aiming for 20 to 30 degrees. As you can see, I have heaps of range. Anything above 30 degrees is what we call optimal range. So we're simply going to lay on our back and test that. You might also notice that one foot is lower than the other. That means we've got an asymmetry in the body. Now, asymmetries are really important to look at because they increase our injury risk factor by up to about 3.5%, or 3.5 times, sorry. So if we do have an uneven side, go through the mobility section that you'll find later to make sure you try and even those sides, and then if that fails, make sure you refer yourself out to a physio for some manual therapy to try and get that as even as possible so we reduce that injury risk. Next up, we have dorsiflexion. Now we can use our dowel again here, and we're simply going to get into that half kneeling position. What we're aiming here for here is the knee to go over the toes, tracking between the big toe and that second toe. So that line between the big and second toe, that's where our knee is tracking forward for. Now, 2 to 4 inches past the toe is acceptable range. 4 inches plus is optimal. And once again, if we have an asymmetry on either side, we want to make sure we sort that out with the mobility provided or referring ourselves out. So we're simply going to keep our heel in contact with the floor, and we're going to push our knee forward as far as we can. We're going to mark that vertically with the dowel and then come out of the movement. Now, as we do this more and more, we may be able to grab range because this is actually a mobility stretch. So what we want to do is do it as few times as possible to get a true reading, and then we can mark one side, which is about 3 to 3.5 inches here, maybe 4, depending. We don't have anything to measure it here, but a guesstimation is fine. And then we switch our sides and we look at that exact measurement. Once again, on this left side, same range, I'm perfectly symmetrical here. You can line up onto a line to know how far you push that knee forward, so then you've got an even measurement on both sides. But like I said, we're looking for asymmetries, and we're also looking for sub-acceptable range of less than 2 inches here. Our 6th test in our 10-step self-screen is our 2-minute push-up plank assessment. Now, everyone does planks, and usually we can get away with doing them for 2 minutes. What I'm concerned with here though is if we can't make that 2-minute block. It means we have issues with shoulder stability, trunk stability, or a couple of other reasons. So all we're looking for is achieving that 2-minute plank. If we can't achieve that, we need to integrate static trunk stability training into our program. So the position for that is hands under shoulders, into that push-up plank position, and we're simply going to hold here for 2 minutes. Remembering, the only concern is if we can't hold that for 2 minutes, we need to make sure we're not dynamically loading a lot of movements because we can't stabilize, and it's a basic strength endurance drill that everyone should pretty much master. Our 7th test in the 10-step self-screen is our toe touch. Now, our toe touch is super useful because we can test it loaded and unloaded, and unilaterally and bilaterally, meaning we can break it down to a point, we can look at mobility or motor control issues, and also those left and right sides to see if any of those asymmetries exist. So first point of call is our standing toe touch. What we're going to do is stand with our feet together, and we're simply going to reach down and touch our toes. Cool, if we can make that, we pass and we move on to the next screen. What happens if we can't though? So the breakouts we can do is that unilateral approach, so we can raise a heel and try and touch our toes. Now, if we raise the other heel and we can't touch our toes, we can see the difference in the side. So if we have our left knee raised and we load that right side and we can't touch our toes, we've obviously got a mobility or motor control restriction on that right hand side. If we can then switch our legs and we touch that side, that verifies that finding. Now, if we can can't touch our toes in either of those heel raised positions or both feet on the ground, we can sit down and unload the movement. Coming down into a sitting position now, we can simply reach forward and try and touch our toes. If we can't touch our toes in this sitting position and we can't touch our toes in the standing position, it's most likely that we have a mobility issue. So we need to work on trigger point and mobility stretches to help lengthen the posterior chain, and also some trunk stability exercises to make ourselves comfortable moving into that forward flexion movement. But if we can touch our toes sitting but not standing, we need to work some toe touch patterning and motor control activities that allows us to improve the movement in our standing position. Our 8th assessment in our 10-step self-screen is our get up and get down test. Our get up and get down test is a really good indication of our durability if we suffer a fall, but it also highlights mobility, flexibility, and strength issues across the whole body because we have a simple testing matrix we can use to assess how mobile and functional we are if we're going from a standing to a floor position and then back up. So there's a couple of little steps here. If you can get back up off the floor to a standing position without using your hands or knees, that's a clear pass. It doesn't matter how you do it, it's just meaning that you can get up and down without using your hands and knees. The second level underneath that is needing to use a hand or a knee to get back up into standing after you bring yourself to the floor. That probably highlights either some mobility or flexibility issues that we need to address. And then finally, a fail is if we actually have to use hands and knees to get up off the floor. So let's take a look at what I mean. Let's do no hands, no knees, an easy pass on our get down and up screen. All we're simply doing is lying down and getting to a position without using our hands or knees. And then getting back up, whichever way possible, we simply stand up. There's no more coaching than that. If you can do that, it means you've got good mobility, flexibility and strength throughout the movement to get up and down. Our second version underneath that is using a hand or a knee. So if we need to take a knee to come down to the floor, to get down now and then lay down, or we need to use a hand to get up, that's a level where it might indicate a mobility or flexibility or strength issue throughout that movement. This should naturally improve over time with training, but what we want to notice is if we are getting up and down off the floor, we need to make sure we're using correct technique and form, as we might be limited somewhere. And finally, somewhere where we need to be concerned, if we need to get down and use a hand and knee to do the same movement, it really means that we have to focus on mobility, stability, and integrating movement patterns before we go to hard training, particularly activities that go from floor to standing like burpees. We need to avoid those until we condition our body and we're comfortable moving through full range without pain or restriction. Our ninth screen for our 10-step self-screen is our 1 foot balance test. A really simple test we can use to see if we need to add stability-based training, i.e. single leg or split stance or balance work into our training to enhance our training effect. If we can't maintain balance on a single foot for the required time, we definitely make sure we avoid things like running or dynamic activity before we can stabilize confidently and with minimal fuss on that single leg stance. So it's as simple as this. We simply bring our leg up and we balance for 20 seconds. So if we lose balance like I just did then, our test starts again. You get 3 attempts at that test, and if you can't pass, we rule that down as a fail, and we should really incorporate things like single leg or split stance strength or balance activities into our training. So we're simply here for 20 seconds. A bit of loss of balance and shifting weight is normal and fine. See if we go from there to there, and we wait for 20 seconds. The next level up on that is also closing our eyes. So if we change our legs now, and we're here in that balance and we close our eyes, and we should still be able to maintain balance. It should become a little bit difficult, but we should still be able to stay steady there. If we can't maintain 20 seconds with our eyes open and our eyes closed, we need to make sure we incorporate that single leg work and that balance work and coordination work into our training. Our final test for our 10-step self-screen is our overhead squat. Now, this is a really good assessment to see where our total mobility and movement is in the squat pattern, because it tests ankle, hip, and shoulder mobility and trunk stability. And it's a really simple test you can do with a dowel or a broomstick and elevating your heels on at about an inch level. So all you need is a plank, or as you can see when we get into it, I'm just using a couple of plates where we raise our ankle to remove the dorsiflexion out of it, and all we're looking for is a pass here. If we can't get into the required position, we need to focus on the elements of mobility that we can feel through the movement that we're lacking, which will be ankle, hip, and shoulder mobility, and that trunk stability to maintain that nice upright position. So our setup, we're going to have that dowel to start on our head and our elbows at 90 degrees, and we're going to press that up. Okay, that's our start position for our shoulders. From here, we're going to have our feet shoulder width apart and our toes pointing forward. Now this is a bit different to our normal squat, but what we're testing here is the total pattern and not your individual squat pattern. So toes forward, feet shoulder width apart, and we're simply squatting down into the movement maintaining a nice upright position. What we're looking for here is pulling forward, any rotation, so any uneven side, or an inability to get to this position or the depth. You can see my hamstrings are on my calves and I'm pretty comfy in here, and we're simply coming up out of the movement. That bar path should be nice and vertical, and all we're looking for is the total movement pattern and how we move through it and where any restrictions might lie. So if you find you can't get into the necessary depth, you want to focus on things like ankle, hip and shoulder mobility and that trunk stability to maintain that upright position.